After looking at Subnautica 2 for a bit now, I think the most interesting thing about the game right now isn't actually the survival systems, the co-op, or even the new world itself. It's the fact that the game somehow launched into early access feeling both successful and more controversial than Unknown Worlds probably expected. Because depending on who you ask, Subnautica 2 is either the natural evolution of the original game or the exact moment the series not losing the thing that people fell in love with in the first place. And honestly, I think both sides kind of have a point because commercially the launch has been absolutely massive. The game reportedly sold over 1 million copies within its first hour and around 2 million within the first 12 hours. Steam concurrent players numbers pushed over 465,000 players almost immediately, which is honestly huge for a survival game, especially one launching in early access. And when you combine that with over 5 million wishlists before release, it becomes pretty clear that Subnautica 2 wasn't just anticipated, it was one of the most anticipated survival games in years. And weirdly enough, I think part of that comes from how unique the original Subnautica still feels even today, because despite how crowded the survival genre has become, there honestly still aren't that many games that replicate how or what Subnautica specifically does well. That mixture of exploration, the fear, the atmosphere, the environmental storytelling, and isolation. Most survival games focus on crafting progression first. Subnautica feels more like Discovery was taking that mantle, and that distinction matters a lot. Now, mechanically, Subnautica 2 feels like a more refined game already. Movement is much smoother, the UI is much more intuitive. Base building has been significantly improved. The world looks much more visually detailed and polished, especially with the Unreal Engine transition. And then there's the co-op, which is probably the single best addition in the game. You can play up to 4 players and you can explore together, you can build together, and you can even survive together. And honestly, that completely changes the tone of the experience because the original Subnautica was fundamentally built around the isolation aspect. You were completely alone in this unknown world that you find yourself in. The ocean felt hostile partly because there were nobody else there with you. And once you introduce co-op, you naturally lose some of that vulnerability. Fear changes when you're not isolated anymore. And I think that's actually the core tension around Subnautica 2 right now. Because if you look at the current sentiment around the game, most people agree that mechanically it's better, but emotionally, that's where the debate starts. A lot of players are saying the game feels less mysterious than the original, less lonely, less oppressive. There's more dialogue now, there's more direct storytelling, more structure, and more character interaction. And some players feel that pushes the experience closer to below zero rather than the original Subnautica, which is interesting because this isn't really a discussion about graphics or systems anymore. It's discussion about the atmosphere, about its identity, about whether improving a game mechanically can sometimes unintentionally weaken the emotional experience that made it memorable. And honestly, I think that's a much deeper design challenge than people might realize, because in game design, there's always this tension between accessibility and ambiguity. The original Subnautica didn't explain everything clearly. It often let silence or distance or uncertainty do a lot of the storytelling. You weren't just progressing through objectives, you were slowly uncovering a place that felt genuinely alien to you. And that uncertainty created tension naturally. But Subnautica 2 seems much more willing to guide the player, and while that makes the experience smoother and probably more approachable for a wider audience, it also changes the emotional pacing quite a bit. The fear becomes much more manageable, the unknown becomes more understandable. And once that happens, the ocean starts feeling slightly less terrifying. Now, that doesn't mean that people might dislike the game, far from it. The overall sentiment is still very positive. A lot of players are basically describing it as Subnautica but better, more polished, more content, better systems, better quality of life. And honestly, for an early access launch, the game seems unusually complete already, especially compared to how rough the original Subnautica was early on. But there are still concerns too. There's the performance issues, there's typical early access bugs, missing content, some balancing problems, and Unreal Engine 5 clearly introduces some technical strains in certain areas, but overall, most people seem surprisingly optimistic about where the game is heading. And then, of course, you can't mention Subnautica 2 without the publisher drama, which honestly feels like something out of a corporate thriller. Because behind the scenes, Subnautica 2 has had one of the strangest publisher situations in recent memory. Krafton, who acquired Unknown Worlds back in 2021, reportedly attempted to remove key leadership figures from the studio, including founders Charlie Cleveland, Max McGuire, alongside CEO Ted Gill. And according to court documents, a major reason appears to have been tied to a massive earnout bonus reportedly worth around $250 million if the game reached certain commercial targets, which already sounds bad enough. But then things became even stranger once reports surfaced that Krafton CEO Changhan Kim, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, he had apparently been using ChatGPT to help brainstorm aspects of a corporate takeover strategy related to this whole situation. And honestly, the internet absolutely ran with that story because it almost sounded too absurd to be real. But what's really interesting is how the community reacted. Instead of damaging the game itself, the controversy almost strengthened player support for Unknown Worlds. A lot of people sided very heavily with the developers. There were boycott threats against Krafton, and once the Delaware court ruled against parts of Krafton's actions and Ted Gill was reinstated as CEO, the whole situation started feeling less like a publisher control and more like a studio surviving corporate interference. And weirdly enough, I think that narrative actually reinforced what players already associate with Subnautica as a franchise. Something creative, distinctive, a little unconventional, not overly corporate. And the fact that Unknown Worlds is now listed much more prominently as both developers and publishers on the Steam page probably matters symbolically more than financially speaking. But overall, I think the most interesting thing about Subnautica 2 right now is that it's not really trying to replicate the original game exactly. It's trying to evolve it, and that's much harder than it sounds, because the original Subnautica worked partly because it captured something accidental or difficult to reproduce. The feeling of being completely alone in an unfamiliar world, and once players already know what Subnautica is, recreating that exact moment or emotional experience becomes much harder. So instead, Subnautica 2 seems to be moving towards something slightly different. Less isolation-driven horror, more cooperative exploration survival, more structured progression, more systems, more polish. And whether that shift ultimately works long-term probably depends on what players actually want from a sequel. Do they want the original feeling recreated, or do they want the formula expanded upon? Because right now, Subnautica 2 feels like a game trying to balance both at the same time. And honestly, that's probably going to define the early access period moving forward. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video. This was a video that I've been waiting to make until the Subnautica 2 early access release period came around. I am hoping to cover more of this game, more about the news surrounding, and more about the player sentiments when players have spent more time with the game. But yeah, that's going to do it for me. Take care, everyone.